Hello and welcome to Miniature Adventures. I'm Big Lee, and this week I want to talk about basing your miniatures. Do you follow convention? So this week's talking point comes from a question I had within the comments from Mr. Blue. So thank you very much for the question. And he asked, I've known quite a few people who play multiple rule sets with one collection, and some have very specific rules about how things should be based. Do you go the extra mile to ensure your bases fit as many of the rule sets you are likely to play, or base them for the game you first plan to play and just make it work? Well, it's a very interesting question actually, and something I hadn't really thought about up till now, and I expect that the answer will probably be different for every gamer and probably infuriate a few. The shorter answer is that I usually tend to base for the rules I want to use, but it may have more to do with the scale that I'm often working in, but I'll come back to that. Of course, this only partially answers the question, and there are nuances as always that I think are worth discussing. So let's start by taking the example of my recent, indeed ongoing, 6mm Wars of the Roses project. When I first approached the period, I looked at various rule sets online, looked at examples that other gamers had done for the period in 6mm. Steal from the best is my motto, along with why reinvent the wheel, especially if someone has already found the solution that you're struggling to find. So in the process I got lots and lots of ideas of how I could base my miniatures and what rules I could use, and of course eventually none of them quite hit the mark for me, but it did give me lots of ideas, plenty to think about, and then I found the Test to Resolve rules, and I found a review and a YouTube video and decided to give them a try. And then when the rulebook arrived, I very quickly decided that was how I wanted to play the game, and settled on replicating the basing convention, i.e. 2 bases for a foot unit, but with 6mm figures on the bases rather than larger bases and larger scale figures. On the whole, I'm really happy with the choice that I've done. If I used a different set of rules that only needs 1 base, for instance, I could just ignore half the bases and just put the one down. If I need a rule set that requires more bases, I can just combine those sets together. And of course, if I need I use a set of rules that requires some form of figure removal, I can just use tokens or dice to record that. A little bit more on-table admin, but nonetheless as a way of using large pre-based figures that are on a single base, for instance. Now, as a counterpoint, when I painted up my 6mm Anglo-Zulu war figures, I had no idea what rule set I was going to use until long after I'd started painting. Now, I hate rebasing figures, so in a fit of madness I made 2 versions of the units, one where a company was represented on a single large base, and then another where the same number of troops were organised on 6 smaller bases. I know, completely crackers, but you know, I was enjoying myself, I was enjoying the painting, and I really didn't mind. As it is, this played into my hands a little bit because I eventually settled on using the men who would be kings as the rules that I was going to use and adapt for this game. So for smaller games, company size battles like Rorke's Drift for instance, I use the smaller bases, and for bigger battles like Isfandana, I can use the larger base units. Again, let me reiterate, I know I'm bonkers, but I was really enjoying the painting, so I'm more than happy to have that compromise, and it's actually played into my hands in the long run. Now, some rule sets obviously do specify certain base sizes, but I think that's becoming increasingly common, or it's becoming increasingly common for rules basing to be somewhat agnostic, for want of a better phrase. Skirmish rules, games like Frostgrave for instance, use single based figures, and for the most part don't really matter what shape bases you put them on, for instance. But there are also mass battle systems like Oathmark and Kings of War that are a little bit more flexible, shall we say, about how those big units are based. I think the general rule of thumb is so long as all the figures on both sides are based the same, it doesn't really matter if the footprint is slightly different to what the rulebook dictates. I'm sure there will be some rules designers and old school wargamers screaming at the screen right now, which is, you know, fair enough. But so please let me know why you disagree with me in the comments below. But as someone who mostly plays in 6mm, the greater scale of course, with big bases and multiple figures rather than singly based figures, then switching between rules systems is a lot easier in my humble opinion. To take this conversation in a slightly different direction than the questioner intended, I'm more interested in how to dress the base. By that I mean the terrain and the vegetation that decorates the ground around your miniatures. Again, to use my Wars of the Roses figures as an example, my painting style with 6mm isn't fantastic, but it produces good, well contrasted figures that look good at arm's length, especially when they're mashed together as a group. So the last thing I wanted to do was let any observer get up close and observe the painting. So I've gone to the extra effort to make the groundwork around the figures stand out a little bit more. And my approach to that is probably worthy of a topic in its own right, to be fair, but essentially I try to use a colour scheme and a style that allows the models to sort of blend into the game mat that I've chosen to use. More is nearly always more when it comes to doing the groundwork on base units, in my humble opinion, especially when I look back 40 or more years ago to the first painted models I ever did with plain painted bases, or worse still, herbs stuck down and used as flock. Gone are the days when I play with armies that smell of oregano. So as usual, I'd like to ask what your opinion is on this subject. Do you rigidly adhere to the basing conventions of the rule sets you play with and rebase when you change those rules? Or like me, are you a bit more of a free spirit or a heretic, depending on your viewpoint, who worries less about basing sizes and more about getting armies down on the table? And as always, I'd love to hear what you think on this subject in the comment section below. So now we've got time for a hobby update, and this week the update is partly delayed because of my review last weekend of the movie Napoleon. I didn't have time to squeeze in a hobby update. So the battle we played was the Battle of Ned's Cabin. The Rejects got together in Stuart's Shed of War for a big game, very big game of Fire and Fury. We were playing a fictional-ish encounter between two broadly similar forces. There was a potential for an unknown number of reserves to come on some point during the game, of course, and there was variation in the quality of the troops and the size of the units on each side, so it wasn't a complete mirror image of each other. I was the Union commanding officer, McDowell, and I was joined by new recruit Dan, facing off against Richard as Jackson, Mark as Lawton and Stuart as AP Hill. On the Union side, we had a nice row of hills to anchor ourselves onto, while the Confederates would have to march across the table into our guns. That being said, I'd forgotten really how ineffectual gunfire is at anything other than close range using these rules. However, within 2 turns, both sides were beginning to engage in melee. On the Union side, we had the benefit, of course, of holding favourable ground, i.e. the heights, but the Confederate forces on the whole had better commanders. It seemed that their luck was firmly on their side. That shouldn't detract at all from the generalship of our opponents, which was excellent throughout the game. In fact, I'd say that nobody on either side made any major tactical blunders, played with honour, and also, of course, the essential factor, good humour. Now, it's been a long time since I've played these rules. In fact, looking at my battle log, the last game I played using these rules was 2019. As I recall, at the time everyone was feeling a little bit deflated by Fire and Fury, and Stuart said he was going to do a little bit of tinkering to see if he could address some of our criticisms. So, for instance, we really didn't like the use of D10s to resolve combat, because it seemed that you could get some extremes of results really quite frequently. So Stuart has changed to using a pair of D6s, which produces a bell curve of results. So of course most of the results will be somewhere around the middle, but there's still the possibility of getting those extreme numbers at either end of the curve, just less frequently. Indeed, in our game we did get some extreme results, with one memorable combat that will probably stick in all of our heads for quite some time. Richard's Virginians charged uphill against my Pennsylvanians, and after various modifiers were taken into account, the melee was actually fairly balanced and would pretty much come down to the dice. I rolled a double 1 and my heart absolutely sank, and then I glanced up, looked across the table and saw that Richard had rolled a double 1 as well. The melee was a draw, so we fought a second round of combat immediately, and this time I rolled an 11. Yes! Only Richard had rolled a 12. My troops were pushed back and disordered, but for a moment all we could do was laugh at the absurdity of the dice and know that we just witnessed something quite unique and unusual. Now, one of the things I've always liked about Fire and Fury is the ebb and flow of combat. Union troops were pushed back, but in the following turn we were able to retake the ground. Both sides were being attritionally ground down. However, by the end of the game it was clear that the Union were getting the worst of it. More importantly, our right flank under my direct control had started to collapse. By this point it was getting late in the afternoon, we were all a little bit tired, and I didn't think another turn of combat would significantly improve our fortunes, even if the dice went entirely in our favour, and of course you can never guarantee that. So I decided to concede the battle. Our forces withdrew from the battlefield, and as is our way, all the players shook hands on a game well played and thoroughly enjoyed. I've posted a load of pictures on my blog, and I'll put a link to that in the comments section below. So that's it for this week. As always, please join the conversation in the comments below. I do really enjoy reading them. If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe and share. And if you want to keep up to date with weekly content from this channel, please tap the bell notification icon. So until next week, stay safe, keep gaming, and of course, keep rolling high.